Hi, my name's Brett Johnson, and I'm a salmon biologist and scientific data specialist at the Hackeye Institute. And today I'm going to be talking about the International Year of the Salmon data mobilization efforts, which I've been engaged with since about 2019. So first off, just an overview, I kind of want to go over the big idea behind data mobilization and what we're trying to do in terms of standardizing and publishing data. Then I'm going to go over some of the more practical components of the work that we've done to really demonstrate how to do data mobilization. So I'm going to go over the data policy that we helped develop for the IYS 2022 expeditions. And then I want to show you what we've built, what we've done, and show you how you can contribute and access data. And then lastly, talk about next steps and generate some discussion and feedback opportunities. But first, I want to give you some brief background. I work for the Hackeye Institute, which is a nonprofit charitable organization that works with many partners to advance science in the public interest. We're highly engaged in developing information systems and mobilizing data. For example, we're involved in the co-development of the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System, and we also serve as a regional collaborative center for the UN Decade of Ocean Science here in the Northeast Pacific. So I guess it's for those reasons that in 2019, Mark Saunders, the executive director of the IYS, approached us related to the International Year of the Salmon data mobilization efforts. So we agreed to work together to produce a strategy for the IYS research expeditions into the high seas and to really figure out how to build these integrated information systems and to mobilize salmon data. And given the international nature of the work, we decided it made sense to organize under the umbrella of the Global Ocean Observing System, which is a program of the United Nations Educational, Science, and Cultural Organization. And the Global Ocean Observing System is a network of organizations and institutions, partners committed to providing the critical physical, chemical, and biological essential ocean variables to understand the climate and provide operational forecasts and really monitor ocean health. And GOOS defines ocean observing requirements, coordinates observing networks, and ensures the flow of data and forecasts, and importantly provides a framework under which to organize our data to contribute to global efforts. So what's the big idea behind data mobilization? Well, I think we're surrounded by data, but really starved for insights because we can't rapidly access, synthesize, and analyze the vast amount of diverse data required to understand the mechanisms driving salmon production. We know salmon cross borders, and now, as a result of the IYS, our scientific relationships across borders are stronger than ever. The IYS High Seas Expeditions has taken a concrete step in developing the human infrastructure, that is, the connections and trust between people, across the Northern Hemisphere to work towards operational salmon ecosystem forecasts. And through the IYS, we've tried to develop a new way of handling data to scale to the extent needed. The old ways of kind of emailing data between trusted colleagues through an opaque research partnership does not scale to the extent needed for an intelligent observing system that can rapidly generate actionable intelligence and insights for ecosystem-based management and ecological forecasting. For that, we need data that are suitable for software, so that's standardized data available in near real time, flowing through purpose-built pipelines on the World Wide Web. And we realized that this could be a lot of work for already overworked and under-resourced researchers, which is why we need the support of our institutions to put in place resources that free the time of researchers up by reducing data wrangling tasks so they can focus more on the science with more complete data sets. Now moving on to some of the more practical aspects of our work, I want to talk a little bit about the data policy. So in coordination with the IYS Secretariat and with input and feedback from the expedition country lead scientists, we developed a data sharing policy. And the goals of the policy were really to, firstly, provide clear expectations to the scientists and organizers regarding data access and release. Secondly, to ensure the fair and equitable use of IYS data while upholding the rights of individual scientists and institutions. And lastly, really encourage the rapid production, publication, and dissemination of scientific data. And following on from that last point, you can see table 1 here, just to remind everyone of the timelines for data sharing. So a lot of the data we're trying to make available immediately as soon as it's been processed to IYS participants. And there's kind of a second timeline for releasing different categories of data publicly. And I just want to draw your attention to a couple of the key finer points in the data policy. So I'll just read this part out here that's highlighted. So data included in the cruise report following the expedition should become publicly available at the same time the report is published. And for IYS participants who would like to use data collected during the 2022 IYS expedition before the data are released publicly, the data provider must be informed and offered collaboration. Lastly, the data provider may object to the usage of the data in a publication if that publication conflicts with his or her own publication strategy. So we've tried to create this wording to make it clear what's expected and what's acceptable in terms of data use. And lastly, the paragraph at the bottom of this slide here just highlights that we're defining the IYS participants as any participants of the expedition whose scientific activities are officially endorsed by the IYS Steering Committee. And I'm not going to read this all out, but there's some more points here. Just generally, co-authorship on publications and other public documentation should be offered, and generally inclusive co-authorship approach is encouraged. And lastly, because the IYS data will serve as a basis for derived and synthesis data products and manuscripts, we want to track the impact of data use from the IYS. So we ask that people use the digital object identifiers that we've assigned to different data sets that can be accessed in the IYS data catalog, which is at iys.hacki.org. And you'll see that DOI in the recommended citation for each data set. Okay, so moving on from the policy, which is kind of this human coordination component of the work that we've done, I'm going to talk a bit more about some of the services that we provided, as well as some of the infrastructure that we've built. So we developed a strategic plan. We developed a data policy, which I just showed you, and we built a data template, which really standardized the data that we were expecting to receive from certain data types on each vessel. That made our job a lot easier to process the data and to publish it in a standardized format. We did a lot of metadata collection and curation. I can't understate how important and how much work that is. And lastly, we did a lot of data standardization and publishing. So that's a lot of writing code to reorganize and restructure data sets. And we kind of took two approaches. We took this global integration and access approach where we were publishing data to domain-specific repositories such as the Ocean Biodiversity Information System or the Canadian Integrated Ocean Observing System. So really utilizing those global standards to facilitate global data access and reuse. And then the second kind of aspect, or the second level of our data mobilization, was really at the project level. So we're integrating each data set into something that is really useful for the project scientists who want to look at the complete data set all together. And coming along with that was managing internal access to the data before it was made publicly available via the global integration and global repositories. So some of the infrastructure that we had to build to do that was, number one, the data catalog. So that's where we hosted all of our metadata records that point to different data sets. So that's the centralized access point for all the different IYS data sets. We've hosted a lot of the data sets on our GitHub data and code server. And then we also built a data mobilization portal, which is just a web page that houses a lot of the documentation regarding data access, data policy, for example, as well as guidelines, tutorials, and synthesized data products, and generally just kind of offered a portal for data users internally to kind of understand our approach and to try to figure out where to go for different data products and data, sources. And lastly, the federated metadata architecture. I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but basically that's a fancy way of saying that our catalog could be indexed and harvested by many other catalogs or search engines, which really increases the discoverability of the data. So the IYS data catalog, here's a snapshot of it. It's at iys.hacki.org, and it really is meant to centralize access to the IYS data. And you can see a few different data sets listed there. So if we clicked on one of those, this is what data record looks like in the IYS catalog. You can see the title, a short abstract. It's got the access and use line where it highlights that we're using Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 licensing, which is an open access license, which just requires data reusers to cite the original data providers. And that citation is provided down at the bottom of this record, along with the digital object identifier that we're asking people to cite. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is the data and resources section, which provides the links to where people can download the data. So if you clicked on the OBIS trawl catch and species abundance data resource, you'll be taken to the Ocean Biodiversity Information System webpage, which looks kind of like this. And this is, I think, really great because you can see, for example, in OBIS, you can see how many times this data set's been cited or downloaded. In this case, it's been cited already 5 times. And so that's what we're really after when we're publishing these data to global open access repositories. We want to see these data reused outside of the original context for which they were collected. So going back to that original data record, you'll see the second resource there is called Data and Supplementary Materials. This is the data that was provided to us that could be made available internally. And so if you want to click on these data, you have to make sure that you're signed in to GitHub. This is the platform that we're provisioning access to internal data. So we have to get you signed up for GitHub, and you have to provide us a username in order to access these data. If you were to click on that link when you're not signed into GitHub, this is what you'll find, a not found message. And it's not that it's not found, it's just that it's private. So what you need to do is sign up for a GitHub account and send your username to iys.data@hacki.org to be granted access to internal data. So a little bit more about the metadata federation. We really want to improve the findability and the discoverability of these data sets. So as I mentioned, the IYS data catalog can be harvested and indexed by other platforms, catalogs, and search engines. So for example, right now, if you go to Google Dataset Search and you type in International Year of the Salmon, you'll see that there's 72 data sets found. And that's great. Some of them come from the IYS catalog. Other ones are from CUSE and CUSE Pacific. And here's what it looks like on CUSE. You'll see that this catalog looks very similar to the IYS catalog because they're built using the same technology and actually by the same developers in this case, because we're involved at Hacki with both CUSE and the International Year of the Salmon. But using this technology is great because these data records can be harvested. For example, another example, this is Data 1, which is a catalog that harvests many different catalogs and is hosted at the University of California, Santa Barbara, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. Okay, so the IYS Data Mobilization Portal is a web page that we put together to really centralize access to the documents, data submission guidelines, data products, and data publishing summaries. You can get there at this URL or by scanning this QR code. And for example, these are the data submission guidelines. So if you're in the process of preparing your data for submission, please refer back to this page. And we're asking that data files get sent to us in a data package, which includes data files, ideally in the IYS data template, which is also on this website, and with a data dictionary defining all of the column names and the variable names if those aren't already defined in the data template. And we'd also really love to see a README file which kind of orients the users in a broad sense to the different contents of the data package, and any supplementary material that you think would be useful or required for data interpretation. So that could be calibration logs for different instruments, or it could be protocols that you used in the lab. Okay, you'll also find on the IYS data mobilization portal a summary of what data has been received. So on the left of this figure, you'll see the different data sets that have been received going back to 2019. So that's the Professor Kaganovsky on the left there. We've received up to 12 data sets. And this is accurate as of September 27th. And moving from left to right, we see the Pacific Legacy, which went out in 2020. And then the remainder of these vessel names are from 2022. So as we receive new data, we'll be adding and updating this figure. And this is just kind of an internal mechanism for us to track what we've received and what we're still waiting for. And similarly, this figure on the right is the number of data sets. These are the core data sets from 2022, which we expected to be published in near real time. So we see basically anything that's green has been received and red has not been received. And if you go on the web portal, you can actually hover over each of these blocks and see which data set's been received and which hasn't. So just another internal tool for us to keep track. Okay, and lastly, I want to talk a little bit about, or second to lastly, our integrated data collection. So I mentioned this early on that we took a global approach in publishing each of the discrete data sets to domain-specific repositories, whether that was species occurrences that we sent to OBIS or CTD data that we hosted on CUSE and ERDAP, for example. We realized the need to integrate the different data sets coming out of the 2022 expedition, as well as the 2019 and 2020. So really making sure that all these data sets can be compared and they're in one file that everybody's confident in. So we've done that for the 2022 trawl data that we've received, as well as the CTD data, and we're continuing now to work on the biogeochemistry data. So that's all the bottle samples, nutrients, chlorophyll, for example. And as the genetic stock ID, stomach contents, and zooplankton data become available, we'll be integrating those as well. So stay tuned. Okay, and lastly, our next step, we're on contract essentially to March 31st. We're not going to drop off the face of the earth after March 31st, which I'll touch on. But essentially until then, we're going to be really focused on expanding the integrated data collection to include more data. And we're going to take in new data and publish that according to the IYS policy. And what we're not really doing is publishing synthesis data sets from papers. So please publish those data sets as required by the journals, and remember to cite the IYS data catalog, recommended citation, and the digital object identifier for the data that was used in your paper. We will be taking in some synthesized data sets though, and I think it is important if those are going to be important to be reused by other members of the IYS, then we should host those as well. So let us know. And beyond March 31st, we're going to be transitioning kind of sort of to an open source project, and I say accepting volunteers kind of tongue in cheek. We'll be continuing to work on this, especially in our efforts to continue to mobilize salmon data with current partners, as well as new partners and new projects, including Becky, which is the basin scale events to coastal impacts projects. So with that, I would just like to say thanks. Again, my name is Brett Johnson. This work has been done with Tim Vanderstap, and you can email either of us with questions or with your data. And I'd like to thank the IYS for the opportunity to do this work. It's been really fruitful, and I think we've made a lot of progress, and I'm just really grateful for the entire IYS Secretariat. So Mark Saunders, Caroline Graham, Aidan Schubert, and Tor Kitching, Stephanie Taylor, and as well as to the NPAFC for supporting this work, the Tula Foundation, and the British Columbia Salmon Research and Innovation Fund, which in part funded this work. So with that, I can take any questions at the email indicated.